woman dismantling power with nothing but truth and a Bible from her mother? What did Jasmine Crockett say that left even Greene speechless? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room inside the Rayburn House office building felt less like a chamber of democracy and more like a courtroom moments before an execution. Rows of mahogany benches gleamed under artificial light. Reporters clustered along the back wall, murmuring beneath the soft hum of suspended cameras. Congressional aides clutched briefing folders to their chests like shields, while the Judiciary Committee members took their seats behind long, elevated desks, watchful, unreadable. The hearing topic was printed in bold on the placards: the role of faith in federal governance. But everyone knew this wasn't about faith. This was about political theater, about who would bleed first. And Jasmine Crockett, a black congresswoman from Texas, known for her precision and poise, walked into that theater not with armor, but with clarity. She wore no crucifix around her neck, no oversized statement piece, only a single silver cross-shaped ring, dull and modest on her left hand. Across the aisle, Marjorie Taylor Greene strutted in late, like an actress craving her cue. Her blonde hair was coiffed with militant neatness. Around her neck hung a massive golden crucifix, polished to perfection, catching the camera's light like a sword unsheathed. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor as she crossed to her seat, eyes scanning, calculating. When she spotted Jasmine across the room, her smile didn't flicker. It widened. Greene adjusted her microphone, leaned forward, and spoke into it with the false sweetness of a poisoned prayer. "You wear a cross, Congresswoman Crockett," she said, her voice sweet but tight with contempt. "Yet you support abortion, same-sex marriage, and drag shows in schools. I have to ask, how can you claim to follow Christ while voting like that?" She paused, letting the bait dangle. "That's not faith. That's hypocrisy." The room didn't explode. It froze. Silence hit like a sucker punch. The Republican side looked smug. The Democratic side looked stunned. The press, trained on Jasmine, suddenly zoomed in, microphones extending like mechanical vultures. Jasmine didn't blink, but something in her shoulders shifted. A quiet, visible tightening, like a boxer exhaling before the first blow. Her eyes met Greene's across the divide, not wide with shock, not narrow with rage, just steady. But the weight was real. For a black woman in a Southern courtroom of politics, being told her faith was invalid wasn't just disrespect. It was a warning shot wrapped in righteousness. Outside, headlines were already forming. Inside, the oxygen thinned. Greene leaned back, confident she had drawn first blood. Her supporters chuckled quietly, just enough for Jasmine to hear. One aide scribbled the word hypocrite in bold on a yellow legal pad. Jasmine reached down, fingers gently brushing the silver cross on her ring. She didn't look away from Greene, not once, but her jaw set like concrete. The cameras caught everything: the cross, the stare, the silence before the storm. And America, whether it knew it or not, was about to witness a turning point, not in law, in moral authority. And in the pause that followed Marjorie Taylor Greene's final word, it wasn't silence that filled the room. It was the collective anticipation of a woman deciding whether to endure the insult or detonate it. Jasmine didn't twitch, didn't flinch, didn't crack. While the temperature in the room dropped several degrees, her composure remained utterly intact. So still it made the movement of her hand lifting the microphone seem monumental. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately, like someone opening a sealed box they've carried too long. The metal mesh of the mic caught the overhead lights for a moment, flickering like a blade. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't glance at her notes. When she spoke, her voice didn't rise. It deepened, steady and low, like a warning sung through stone. "I don't wear this cross to prove I'm perfect," she said, her gaze locked on Greene, tone razor flat but soul deep. "I wear it to remind myself every single day that justice without compassion is not justice at all." The room didn't breathe. Jasmine leaned in, her voice now quiet enough to demand listening. "I wear it because I don't want to become what I fight." Greene shifted slightly in her seat. The smirk didn't vanish, but it cracked at the edges. Around the chamber, phones stopped typing. Staffers froze mid-breath. The golden crucifix around Greene's neck glinted, bright but suddenly empty. Jasmine's words hadn't been loud, but they landed with a force that made sound unnecessary. It wasn't rebuttal, it was reckoning. Crockett didn't offer scripture, she offered truth. A truth not built on posture or optics, but on survival. On knowing what it meant to be doubted, dismissed, disrespected, not for failure, but for daring to stand. The mic didn't tremble in her hand, but something else did, beneath the surface of the moment, in the posture of the room. Power had just shifted, and everyone knew it. But Jasmine wasn't done, because the truth she carried didn't come from a podium or a Twitter thread. It came from childhood pews and the quiet pain of being told her faith would never be enough. "I was raised in the church," Jasmine said, her voice soft but full, like something steady rising through silence. "Not a church with air conditioning and sound systems. Ours had ceiling fans that squeaked when the heat hit 100, and pews that gave you splinters if you shifted too fast." A few people smiled without meaning to. She didn't pause. "I was raised by women who prayed with their whole bodies, who cooked for families that weren't theirs, who read the Bible not to win arguments, but to survive the week." She looked at Greene again. Not angry, just deeply tired of pretending people like her needed to explain themselves to people like this. "Those women taught me that faith doesn't look like performance. It looks like mercy. It looks like staying kind when the world calls you a threat." Her voice stayed even, but something in the room cracked. "And they taught me something else. Something I carry with me every time I walk into a space where my skin, or my politics, or my silence gets interpreted as unworthy." Her eyes moved across the dais now, to the people who hadn't spoken. "They taught me that judgment without compassion is just cruelty in church clothes." The words didn't land hard. They sank in slowly, like water soaking into old stone. A few members of the committee shifted in their seats. One staffer behind Greene stopped typing mid-note. Even the press pool, usually too busy watching through lenses, began exchanging glances. Because what Jasmine was saying wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't built for headlines. It was built from real rooms, real churches, real experiences where people had told her she was too loud, too proud, too political, too black to wear the same faith they claimed. She had heard it whispered in Sunday school. She had heard it screamed on the campaign trail. And now here it was again, this time in front of the nation, wrapped in a gold cross and broadcast live. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She just told the truth. The impact wasn't loud, it was cumulative. People weren't cheering, but they were listening. Jasmine had turned Greene's insult into a quiet mirror, and some in the room were seeing their reflections for the first time. Greene didn't respond right away. She tilted her head, eyebrow arched, as if waiting for the moment to pass. But it didn't. The moment held. It breathed. Jasmine leaned back slightly, ring catching the light just once, her hand resting calmly on the table. She had said what needed to be said, not to win, but to remind everyone that faith is not a weapon, and truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand. But Greene didn't step back. She stepped in, because when power starts to feel threatened, it rarely softens. It sharpens. With one hand resting dramatically on her stack of notes, Greene nodded toward the screen behind her. "Let's take a look at what faith looks like now," she said, voice syrupy and loaded. The projector buzzed, and images flickered into view. A series of photographs. Jasmine at an LGBTQ pride march, smiling, arms raised, surrounded by activists. In one, she held a rainbow flag overhead. In another, she stood next to a trans teenager in a wheelchair, clapping as the crowd cheered. The pictures were full of color, life, and light, but Greene wielded them like evidence in a courtroom. "There she is," she said, pointing with her pen. "Your cross-wearing congresswoman, parading with drag queens, celebrating abortion rights, cheering on a movement that tears down biblical values and replaces them with confusion." Her tone was calm, almost amused. That made it worse. "And yet she comes in here today wearing a symbol of Christ around her finger, like it means something." She turned back toward the committee, hands spread wide like a preacher at a pulpit. "Tell me, how does that square with Scripture? How does holding a pride flag match Micah 6:8? How does supporting men in lipstick and children changing genders reflect walking humbly with God? She didn't wait for an answer. She didn't want one. She was building an image, carefully, ruthlessly. This isn't courage, she said. This isn't conviction. This is branding. Political theater dressed up in moral language. A woman who has chosen applause over obedience, trends over truth. Then she paused just long enough to make her next words hit like a slap. She wears the cross, she said coldly, but she stands with sin. The final sentence landed like stone against glass. No shouting, no outrage, just a thick, uncomfortable stillness. One aide at the back of the room glanced around, unsure whether to keep typing or stop. A reporter lowered his camera just for a moment. Even a few of the committee members, hardened by years of political sparring, looked away. But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't fold her arms. She didn't break eye contact. Her stare stayed fixed, locked onto Greene, not with anger but with something colder. Measured, waiting. Her hands rested calmly on the table, fingertips lightly touching the edge of her notes. She didn't fidget. She didn't flinch. It was the look of someone who had heard this kind of attack her entire life, and who had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful answer is silence before the strike. Jasmine didn't fire back with volume. She didn't match Greene's outrage or step into her theater. She reached for something heavier than anger. She reached for truth with evidence. Without a word, Jasmine pressed a single button on the touchpad in front of her. The large wall screen, still dimmed from the slideshow of pride images, flickered back to life. "Madam Chair," Jasmine said, her voice low and controlled, "with permission, I'd like to introduce a different set of images into the record." No one objected. No one dared. The screen changed, and the tone of the room changed with it. Gone were the bright colors and smiles. Now came grainy surveillance stills, black and white photographs, and local news clips. A series of images began to rotate in silence. Children wrapped in torn sleeping bags, their bodies curled beneath highway overpasses. A toddler with no shoes, sitting alone in a parking lot beside a grocery cart full of trash bags. A girl no older than 9, holding a cardboard sign that read, "I'm hungry, not invisible." No music, no narration, just raw, brutal reality. Jasmine stood slowly. "These children," she said, motioning to the screen, "aren't hypothetical. They're not props in some moral debate. They're real." Her tone sharpened, but it didn't rise. "They are living in your districts, on your watch." She tapped the screen again, and a spreadsheet filled with voting data overlaid the next image. A sobbing boy in a shelter hallway, head down, surrounded by police tape. The heading at the top, Amendment 4327, Federal Aid for Homeless Children, failed by House vote. Jasmine looked toward Greene, her stare steady. Congresswoman Greene voted against it. Against them. A few members stirred. One woman shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The gallery, previously whispering, had gone completely still. Jasmine let the numbers linger in the air like smoke. Then she stepped forward, just slightly, and asked, not shouted, not accused, but asked, "You say you're pro-life? You say God speaks through your votes?" She glanced back at the image now showing a mother and infant sleeping on a sidewalk outside a closed shelter. But where was that voice when it came time to feed these children, to clothe them, to keep them warm? Her voice broke slightly, not from weakness, but from choosing to let people feel what she refused to hide. "You defend life before birth like it's sacred," she continued, eyes back on Greene. "But the second a baby draws breath, that life becomes someone else's problem." Greene didn't speak. She sat rigid, lips pursed, trying to appear unfazed, but her silence was growing louder by the second. Jasmine pointed back to the screen. Now it displayed a simple headline from a local Georgia paper. "Greene votes no on child housing bill as winter deaths rise." Below it, a photo of a shelter turned away 56 families in one night. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't grin. She just looked at Greene and said the one thing the entire room was already thinking. "You protect the unborn, but you abandon the born. Is that your faith?" The sentence didn't echo. It hit and it stayed. A breathless tension filled the chamber. Jasmine returned to her seat but didn't sit down. Her hands rested lightly on the table, palms flat, as if grounding herself. Around the room, lawmakers who had sat passively began shifting, some uncomfortable, some now fully attentive. One Republican aide quickly tucked away a notepad bearing a pre-written press quote. A Democrat on the far right of the panel whispered something to a colleague, but no one laughed. The image on the screen hadn't changed. It was still that girl, the one with the cardboard sign. I'm hungry, not invisible. And for the first time all morning, no one could look away from her. Greene finally cleared her throat, but no words followed. She blinked once, twice, and looked down. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't move. She didn't have to, because the moment had already landed. The room was still, but it wasn't silent. It was reckoning. No fury, no applause. Just consequence hanging in the air like the smell of smoke after a controlled burn. Jasmine's voice had asked the question, but it was the images, the facts, that delivered the indictment. She didn't call Greene a hypocrite. She didn't have to. She just showed the math. And in politics, sometimes the most dangerous thing a woman can do is show the truth and stay quiet. But even facts weren't enough, not in a room like this. So Jasmine reached for something older than the debate itself, something no one could interrupt, twist, or vote down. She slipped her hand into the inside pocket of her blazer and pulled out a small leather-bound book. Faded, creased, and worn at the corners like it had lived through storms. The cover was frayed, its once gold lettering nearly gone, but it was unmistakably a Bible. She didn't lift it high. She didn't make a show of it. She simply placed it gently on the table in front of her, like setting down a piece of history. Then she opened it to a page already marked, the paper thinned from time and touch. This belonged to my mother, she said quietly, her thumb pressed against the edge. She kept it next to her bed, even when we had no heat in winter, even when we had no bed. The room was dead silent, no rustling, no shifting, just the hum of electricity and the sound of pages turning. Jasmine looked up, her voice calm and even. And this is the verse she made me memorize first. She cleared her throat once, not because she was nervous, but because the words meant something, and she needed them to land exactly right. Micah chapter 6, verse 8, she said, letting each word rise and fall like slow hammer strikes. He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. She didn't rush. She didn't embellish. She read it as it was. Then she looked up, not at the panel, not at the cameras, but directly at Greene. Her gaze didn't blink. It burned. You quote scripture, she said, her voice lower now, sharper. I live it. The words didn't echo in the chamber. They settled, heavy and immovable. Like the truth they carried didn't need to be loud to be devastating. For a long moment, Greene didn't move. Her hands, which had previously danced with confidence across notes and microphones, now sat stiff on the table. Her expression didn't crack, but it no longer held the same steel. She opened her mouth slightly, as if to speak, then closed it again. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side, a gold-plated cross and a wall of judgment. On the other, a woman with a battered Bible, speaking softly about mercy. And yet the weight in the room had shifted entirely toward Jasmine. The gallery remained breathless. The cameras held steady. Even the committee chair had leaned forward, chin resting on one hand, no longer pretending neutrality. There was no need for applause. The silence itself had become acknowledgement. Jasmine didn't press further. She didn't capitalize on the moment. She let it be what it was, undeniable. She turned the page of the Bible slowly, reverently, and then closed it with both hands. Her fingers lingered on the worn leather for a second longer than necessary, as if grounding herself in something bigger than the chamber she sat in. My mother believed that following God wasn't something you broadcast, she added softer now. It was something you practiced when no one was watching. The words stung because they didn't accuse. They reminded. And reminders have a way of unraveling self-righteousness far more effectively than anger ever could. In the back of the room, someone sniffed, trying to hold in a tear. On the far right, a staffer blinked rapidly and looked down. Greene adjusted her seat but said nothing. Her fingers twitched slightly on the desk. It was a small movement, but in a room trained to watch everything, it was enough. Jasmine slowly slid the Bible back into her jacket. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just exhaled once quietly and sat back in her chair. No gavel was struck. No ruling was given. But something had been settled, and every person present could feel it. Not a victory of debate, but a reclamation of what faith actually meant. And in that moment, stripped of theatrics, the truth didn't need to shout. It simply stood and did not move. Greene had been silent too long, and she knew it. So when she spoke again, she didn't fight back with logic. She reached for sentiment, the last refuge of a cornered argument. She adjusted her microphone, her fingers trembling just enough to register on camera, and took a breath meant to sound composed. "I want to tell you a story," she began, her tone gentler now, softer than anything she'd used all morning. "About a young woman in Georgia who found herself pregnant after a one-night mistake. She was scared, alone, no money, no support. She was just a teenager, and she thought about ending it." Greene paused here, letting the image settle in the room like fog. But abortion was illegal in her state, so she carried the baby to term. And that baby, he's a doctor now, saving lives in the very community that once turned its back on his mother. A few quiet murmurs rippled through the gallery. Greene leaned back slightly, her voice trembling. In that way, practiced speakers learn to imitate sincerity. "That's the power of life. That's what we fight for. Not politics, not theater, just second chances wrapped in tiny hands." For the first time in nearly 20 minutes, the mood in the chamber began to shift. Slowly, subtly, like a current changing direction under still water. A woman seated behind the panel dabbed her eye with a tissue. One staffer nodded. A young aide on the far end of the dais folded her hands in her lap and whispered something to her colleague, who responded with a slow, almost reluctant nod. Even the committee chair, previously expressionless, sat up a little straighter, caught in the pull of a story that felt human, uncomplicated, morally clean. Greene had offered no facts, no laws, no legislative data, just narrative, warmth, and redemption. It was effective. It always was. Because stories about happy endings don't ask people to think, they ask people to feel. And when feelings are strong enough, they start to sound like truth. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't frown. She didn't even shift in her seat. While the temperature in the room bent toward Greene's story, Jasmine's posture didn't budge. Her hands remained folded, her spine perfectly straight, her eyes fixed on Greene. Not in disbelief, not in scorn, but in perfect, measured stillness. The kind of stillness that signals a storm is being held back. The kind that says, "I've heard your story, but I've lived its opposite." One that didn't end in applause or diplomas or proud headlines. One where second chances were never offered. One where carrying the pregnancy wasn't salvation. It was a sentence. Jasmine's eyes didn't accuse, but they didn't agree, and the contrast was electric. Greene had wrapped herself in a success story, but Jasmine was still holding the weight of all the stories that never got told. Greene continued, sensing momentum and pushing forward, her voice trembling, just enough to sound real. "Every life matters," she said, glancing at the committee, "even the ones that come from pain, even the ones that weren't planned." She placed her hand over her heart. "We owe it to the unborn to protect them, even when it's hard." The room was still again, but not breathless this time. Divided. Some leaned toward her words. Others sat rigid, resisting their pull. The photos of homeless children were still fresh in their minds. The verse from Micah still hung in the air. But Greene was counting on something stronger than contradiction. Comfort. The comfort of a clean ending, of a life that worked out. And for a moment, just a moment, it seemed to be working. But Jasmine knew better. She'd seen how easily a well-placed story could eclipse the suffering of millions. She'd watched how one polished anecdote, one "he's a doctor now" fairy tale, could be used to justify 100 votes that left children freezing under bridges. She knew this play. She'd lived on its losing end. So she didn't interrupt. She didn't rebut. She simply waited, eyes clear, jaw steady, like someone holding back fire, not because she lacked the fuel, but because she knew exactly where to aim. In that moment, she let Greene's applause line settle. Let it breathe. Let it look victorious. Because Jasmine Crockett was done defending. She was about to prose Greene's story had landed. But Jasmine hadn't come to trade fables. She had come to confront the cost of laws written without mercy. Without speaking, Jasmine reached forward and tapped her touchscreen. The room's lights dimmed slightly as the monitor behind her flickered to life again. But this time, there were no speeches, no headlines, no music. Just a single scanned page slowly fading into view. A hospital intake report, time-stamped and sealed. The heading read, patient name withheld. Age 11. Victim of sexual assault. Murmurs started, then stopped as another document replaced it. A police statement, barely legible, recounting how the girl's mother found blood on her daughter's bed sheets and a positive pregnancy test 3 weeks later. Then came the ultrasound, then the court order, then the refusal to allow a termination, because the state law, co-sponsored and publicly championed by Greene, did not permit exceptions for rape or incest. The room held its breath. Jasmine didn't turn away from the screen. She stood up slowly, as if lifting more than just her body. "This is not a story," she said, voice low, controlled. "This is a file." She motioned toward the screen again. She was 11. She weighed 86 pounds. She loved science class and drawing birds. The next slide appeared, a hand-drawn sketch of a sparrow submitted to her school's art contest 1 week before the assault. The contrast was crushing. A child's art, bright, soft, innocent, juxtaposed against legal documents that read like a slow-motion collapse. Jasmine turned to the panel now, her voice gaining gravity. She asked one question when the court denied her request. "Will it hurt the baby if I'm still growing?" A man in the back of the chamber audibly inhaled. No one else moved. Then came the final photo. Not of the girl, but of the hospital bed. A pink stuffed animal sat on the tray next to her. The fourth line ran down to her small arm. The image was intentionally blurred, anonymized, but it didn't matter. Everyone in that room felt like they'd seen her. Jasmine let the image linger before speaking again. "You talk about life, Congresswoman Greene," she said, turning her head toward her opponent. "But you voted to force this child to give birth to her rapist's baby. You call that life?" Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The truth did the rising for her. "You didn't protect her. You sentenced her." The words echoed, not because they were loud, but because no one dared interrupt them. For the first time all morning, Greene said nothing. Her hands tightened slightly on the edge of her desk. She tried to hold eye contact but failed. Her gaze dropped, not dramatically, just enough for everyone to see it. And in political theater, a lowered glance is louder than a shouted objection. The temperature in the room changed again. Reporters didn't type. Staffers didn't whisper. Even those who might have disagreed with Jasmine's politics found themselves unwilling, unable, to look away from the evidence on the screen. It was not opinion. It was not spin. It was a fact, given a face, given weight. And it had crushed every comfortable story before it. Jasmine walked back to her chair but remained standing, hands flat on the table. Her eyes moved slowly down the row of lawmakers, one by one, not accusing, but daring them to speak. No one did. Not Greene. Not the committee chair. Not the aide who had been jotting down talking points earlier. Jasmine didn't press further. She just stood in that heavy silence, letting the consequences fill the void. And in that moment, the entire chamber knew there was no recovery from this. No quote that could reframe it. No spin that could soften it. Because what Jasmine Crockett had done wasn't win a point. She had opened a wound the system worked hard to keep hidden, and no one, not even Marjorie Taylor Greene, could stop the bleeding. The evidence had spoken, but Jasmine knew some truths couldn't be told. They had to be shown. She tapped the console again. The room dimmed for the final time. No music played, no headlines scrolled. Just one frame appeared, grainy but raw, captured on a phone, shaky from wind, but steady in meaning. A woman sat on the edge of a concrete loading dock behind an abandoned grocery store. Her coat zipped halfway, her eyes low, a child no older than 2 curled up in her lap. Her hair was unwashed, her fingers chapped, her boots mismatched. But around her neck, tied loosely with string, hung a small brass cross. Broken in the center, one arm of it bent as if snapped by time. There was no narration, no subtitles, only the ambient noise of passing cars and a distant train, and the occasional whisper of the child mumbling in sleep. Jasmine said nothing. She simply let the room watch. The video continued. Jasmine stepped into the frame. No entourage, no mic, no jacket with a congressional pin. Just her. She crouched down, handed the mother a folded blanket, then a paper bag, then nothing at all. For a moment, they just sat together, not talking, just being. The camera shook slightly as the woman said something, too quiet to hear. Jasmine nodded, then the child stirred, reached out, and grabbed Jasmine's hand. The mother smiled, a weak, tired smile, but real. Her thumb rubbed absent-mindedly across the broken cross as she looked away from the camera. The image froze on that. A mother, a cross, and silence between 2 women who understood the weight of being forgotten. No one spoke. Not in the room, not on the dais, not in the gallery. A man in the second row reached for his handkerchief and didn't bother to hide it. A younger aide on Greene's side of the bench blinked too fast, swallowed, and turned her face toward the floor. The chairman stared at the screen as if it had just shown him something about America he'd spent a decade avoiding. And Greene, still seated, still rigid, didn't even try to reach for the mic. Her hand hovered above it, then dropped. Her eyes flicked once toward Jasmine, and for the first time since the hearing began, there was no calculation behind them. No counterattack, just stillness, because there was nothing to say. Jasmine didn't narrate the moment. She didn't break the spell with another soundbite or quote. She simply let the silence stretch, not as a tactic, but as testimony. She knew what she had shown was not dramatic. It wasn't explosive, but it was undeniable. A woman who wore her broken cross without ceremony. A mother who didn't quote scripture, but still lived it. The room could feel the weight of that contrast, that in all the posturing, the policy, the political firestorms, this quiet woman on the screen had embodied more dignity than the walls around her had seen in years. Jasmine folded her hands on the desk and looked down, not to avoid attention, but to release it. She had made her point, without a single word. The screen faded to black. The lights rose slowly, as if even the electricity was reluctant to return to politics as usual. The committee chair cleared his throat, but didn't speak. Someone tried to stand, then sat back down. Jasmine remained still, her posture perfectly composed, her ring faintly catching the light again. One clean silver cross, whole, unbroken. Across from her, Greene finally looked up, but not with fire, not with fury, with the pale, stunned silence of someone who had mistaken theater for truth and lost control of the script. Her hands folded awkwardly over one another. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She simply stopped. Because when the words run out, and the arguments fail, and the symbols lose their shine, what's left is what's real. And on that screen, in the simplest, quietest way possible, Jasmine Crockett had shown everyone in the room what real faith looked like, what real suffering looked like, what real courage meant. And when it was over, nobody clapped. Nobody dared. Because no one claps during a reckoning. They just sit in the quiet and listen to what they can no longer unsee. The hearing had ended in silence, but outside those walls, the silence didn't last. Truth once seen doesn't stay quiet. It started with a clip just under 2 minutes long. No intro music, no commentary, just Jasmine Crockett sitting across from Marjorie Taylor Greene. The screen behind her fading into black after showing a mother holding her baby in the cold. A broken cross swaying at her neck. Someone had captured the moment from the press row and uploaded it to Twitter with only one line. This is what real faith looks like. Within an hour, it had 300,000 views. By midnight, it had crossed 7 million. The algorithm couldn't resist it. The quiet tension, The unbearable contrast. The calm in Jasmine's eyes as Greene, for the first time in the hearing, had nothing to say. People didn't scroll past it. They watched. They rewound. They shared it not for entertainment, but because it hit something. And when something hits that deep, it spreads like fire. By morning, the hashtags had formed themselves. Faith not fear, cross not control, mercy over morality, and the most searing of them all. She carried the cross. They appeared first on TikTok slideshows set to gospel hymns, then on Instagram reels from young black pastors, then on Reddit threads full of lapsed churchgoers who said Jasmine Crockett was the first politician in years to make them feel God again. Memes gave way to op-eds. Screenshots of the Bible verse she quoted were posted beside photos of the girl forced to carry her rapist's baby. Threads with millions of impressions began tracing Greene's voting history, not through political analysis, but through faces. Faces of children, of mothers, of women denied help in states where laws like Greene's had passed. The public wasn't just reacting, it was connecting dots, and it was doing it faster than any press secretary could spin. Within 24 hours, churches began to speak. Not political statements, spiritual ones. The First AME Church in Atlanta released a video on Facebook, the pastor standing at his pulpit with Micah 6:8 behind him in stained glass. Jasmine Crockett reminded us, he said plainly, that mercy is not a weakness, it is the root of righteousness. Across the country in South LA, an entire Sunday service was devoted to replaying Jasmine's speech and the silent video of the mother on the street. The pastor stood afterward and said, "She didn't speak to power. She spoke through it. That's what prophets do." In Chicago, Reverend Tanya Grant called Jasmine's testimony the first time in years I've seen scripture used not to control, but to heal. These weren't small statements. They were reversals from pulpits that had long avoided politics, now rising in defense of something too moral to ignore. Cable news couldn't keep up. By the time Greene tried to schedule a Fox News appearance to reclaim her ground, she was already trending. Not for her message, but for her silence. Clips of her glares, her stillness, her inability to respond were now layered over gospel music and captions like, "When the word speaks louder than the law." Even anchors who normally echoed Greene's rhetoric hesitated. They played the Jasmine clip in full because to cut it felt dishonest. Meanwhile, MSNBC ran a special titled "When Faith Meets Courage," with a panel of faith leaders and legal scholars analyzing Crockett's approach as a blueprint for values-based resistance. One rabbi said, "What she did wasn't just political, it was pastoral. She led that room without a pulpit." And Twitter, brutal as it can be, had little appetite for mockery. This wasn't a culture war moment. It had crossed into moral reckoning. Even some of Greene's allies began to shift. Quietly at first, a former speechwriter posted a thread saying he was unsettled by how completely unprepared she'd been to respond to Crockett's restraint. A longtime conservative strategist admitted in a podcast, "We've built a message on protecting life, but what Crockett did was ask what happens after, and we had no answer." Greene's usual fire faded into hedging. In a leaked internal memo, her team debated whether to defend or deflect. One aide wrote, "We can't go after her. It'll look like we're attacking faith itself." Another, more bluntly, "She didn't beat us with rage. She beat us with reverence." By midweek, clips of Greene at past rallies mocking single mothers resurfaced and were immediately contrasted with Jasmine holding the hand of that woman on the street, kneeling down without cameras. The internet never forgets, and this time, it was choosing sides. But not everyone chose sides for political reasons. Some did it because of how they felt. In Kansas, a Catholic grandmother posted on Facebook that she cried when she saw Jasmine's hand resting on the Bible passed down from her mother. In Baton Rouge, a youth pastor showed the clip to a confirmation class and said, "This is why integrity matters more than sound bites." On the floor of a dorm room in Portland, 3 college girls who had never been to church stitched together Jasmine's speech with their own stories of growing up in the systems that saw them as disposable. They ended the video with one line, "If that's what faith looks like, we want in." And yet, while Jasmine's name trended for days, she made no victory lap, No fundraising emails, no merchandise. She declined interview after interview. Her office released only one statement. We thank those who heard the message. Now let's serve the people still living it. It wasn't showmanship, it was stewardship. The same kind she had witnessed in her childhood church. The kind where the sermon ended, not with applause, but with action. And that, perhaps more than anything, is what rattled Greene's world. Jasmine hadn't just delivered a blow to her narrative, she'd replaced it, rewritten what the cross meant, who got to carry it, and why silence, when chosen, could roar louder than 1,000 podiums. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't gone viral because she shouted the truth. She had gone viral because she refused to bow to anything less than it. By the end of the week, Jasmine Crockett's name had been printed on op-eds, spoken from pulpits, and whispered in offices that once mocked her. But where she chose to speak again wasn't Washington. It was a small red brick church in South Dallas, nestled between a worn-out community center and a shuttered corner store with a sun-faded Pepsi sign. The gravel parking lot was already full before sunrise. Inside, the pews creaked with memory, scratches from restless knees, carvings of initials from bored kids, hymnal books frayed at the edges like well-loved Bibles. This wasn't a megachurch. There were no screens, no live band, just a wooden cross above the pulpit, a ceiling fan that turned slower than the heat demanded, and the kind of silence that felt like reverence, not absence. Some who sat in those pews had known Jasmine when she was 8, too shy to speak in front of class. Others had watched her leave for law school, certain she'd never come back. And now, on a gray Sunday morning, they waited, some hopeful, some guarded, to hear what she'd say after shaking the conscience of a nation. Jasmine didn't enter through the side door or with an entourage. She walked up the center aisle like everyone else, alone, Bible in one hand, a folder in the other. The silver cross-shaped ring still glinted faintly on her left hand. No cameras, no stage lighting, just sunlight breaking through stained glass and falling gently across her shoulders as she climbed the 2 steps to the pulpit. Her eyes scanned the crowd, not looking for applause but familiarity. She saw Sister Marlene, who used to scold her for whispering during prayer. Mr. Howard, who gave her first ride to debate club. Old neighbors, new skeptics, children too young to understand what had happened, but old enough to know she mattered. Jasmine took a breath, not to calm herself, but to anchor something deeper. Then she opened her Bible and spoke. I didn't come here today to talk about Washington, she said, voice clear but soft. I didn't come to relive the hearings, or the headlines, or the hashtags. The room didn't stir. I came here because this is where I learned what a cross means. She paused, hands resting on the edges of the pulpit, like a woman returning to the place where she first learned to stand. I remember sitting right there. She nodded toward the 4th row on the left. Between my mother and the window, tracing my fingers along this ring and asking why some people wore crosses and others didn't. Her smile flickered, but her eyes stayed sharp. My mother told me, baby, wearing it's easy, carrying it, that's the hard part. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the congregation, quiet but rising like warmth through cold. Jasmine opened the folder in front of her, revealing only a single sheet. She didn't read it. She just touched it. This past week, people kept asking me why I didn't yell, why I didn't throw the insult back. She looked around the room. And I told them, because that's not what this ring is for. She raised her left hand, not high, just enough for the glint to catch light. I don't wear the cross to judge anybody. I wear it to remind myself that the real test of faith isn't in how loud you speak, but in how you treat those nobody hears. Her voice didn't shake. It deepened. I wear it to remember that justice is not the same thing as punishment, and that mercy isn't weakness. It's proof you survived something. The room grew still, not frozen, but humbled. Jasmine turned her eyes toward the back row, where 2 teenage girls sat whispering nervously. You'll be told that power is what happens when people listen to you, she said, but real power is what you carry when they don't. She didn't preach. She testified. Real power is staying kind when you're called angry, staying firm when you're called unqualified, staying present when they try to erase you. The older members nodded. The younger ones leaned in. No one checked their phone. No one shifted to leave. It wasn't just a speech, it was a reckoning. Jasmine stepped back from the pulpit, slowly closed the Bible, and held it against her chest. Then she looked out over the sanctuary one final time and said the words that would be quoted for years. I don't wear this cross to prove I'm right. I wear it to remind myself to always choose justice over power. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't look for validation. She stepped down the stairs the same way she came, quietly, deliberately, her heels tapping softly against the wooden floor. And the sound that followed wasn't noise. It was something deeper. The first clap came from the back, then two rows up, then a ripple that spread not like a cheer, but like a decision. The sound of people rising, not because they agreed, but because they had seen something they couldn't unsee. One by one, the room stood, not in excitement, but in recognition, not to support a politician, but to follow a principle. Some wiped their eyes. Others just stood with hands at their sides, heads slightly bowed. The standing ovation wasn't for the moment. It was for the message. Outside, the sky broke open with light rain, soft, barely touching the sidewalk, like a baptism that didn't need ceremony. People didn't rush. They walked slowly, their conversations hushed. Some approached Jasmine near the exit, not for selfies, but for silence. A hand on the shoulder, a nod that said, "We hear you now." No interviews were given. No reporters were allowed past the sidewalk. But by noon, someone had posted the full recording on YouTube. The title was simple, "The Cross She Carried." And by evening, the comments read like a prayer book. She reminded me why I still believe. That's what my faith should feel like. Not politics. Purpose back inside, the church lights dimmed. Only a custodian remained, sweeping crumbs from the floor and glancing toward the pulpit. And on that wooden platform, beneath the quiet hum of an old ceiling fan, something invisible had been left behind. Not a performance, not a victory, just a line in the sand, drawn not with anger, but with grace. And this time, no one dared cross it. Hours after the last hand had been shaken, after the final pew creaked and the exit doors clicked shut behind the last congregant, Jasmine Crockett remained seated in the front row of her childhood church. The pulpit now stood in silence, bathed in dim evening light filtered through old stained glass that painted the hardwood floor in broken fragments of gold, green, and blue. Her heels sat beside her, empty as hushed applause. She hadn't spoken since her final line. She didn't need to. The echo of what had been said still pressed against the walls like heat. She ran her hands slowly over the smooth spine of her mother's Bible, tracing the leather edge with her fingertips. It was the same pew she had sat in as a child, legs swinging just above the floor, watching her mother underline verses with a pen half out of ink. Jasmine remembered the smell of her mother's perfume, the warmth of her lap, the soft sound of pages turning behind her during the sermon. Now there was nothing but silence, and it wasn't hollow. It was sacred. The streetlights flickered on outside one by one, casting soft orange light through the stained glass windows. A light rain had started again, tapping gently on the old paneled roof, a rhythm older than memory. Across the aisle, the shadow of the cross fell on the floor beside her, not looming, just present. Constant. She leaned forward, elbows on knees, letting her breath slow, her heartbeat steady. No press, no cameras, no staff reminding her of tomorrow's meetings. Just her and the church that made her. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket, but she didn't reach for it. She didn't need more noise. She didn't need to know what cable anchors or columnists or strangers behind keyboards were saying. The only voice she needed to hear now had already spoken, in the silence that came after the truth. Outside, a few people still lingered on the sidewalk. Some stood beneath umbrellas in quiet conversation. Others simply stared at the building as though it were more than brick and mortar tonight, as though something had shifted inside and was still echoing out. Across the street, someone had written a verse in chalk near the curb. Micah 6:8. The handwriting was crooked and uneven, likely from a child, but it stopped several people in their tracks. A woman in a green shawl knelt beside it and touched the letters gently, like tracing scripture from a scroll. Down the block, a group of teens who had only come out of curiosity now sat on the church steps, quiet, scrolling through clips of the speech they just heard live. One of them whispered, "She didn't even raise her voice," and the others nodded, as if that made it hit harder. In a world that rewarded shouting, Jasmine's calm had felt like thunder. Inside, she opened the Bible again. Pages crackled softly in the still air, worn edges slipping beneath her fingers. Her mother's handwriting filled the margins, verses underlined, prayers scribbled between the lines. On one page there was a note in faded blue pen: "Don't let the noise decide who you are. Let God find you in the quiet." Jasmine smiled faintly. She could still hear her mother's voice saying it, gentle, unshaken, always followed by a kiss on the forehead. This book had survived moves, elections, loss. It had been forgotten in suitcases, dropped in parking lots, held tight during funerals. Now it sat in her lap again, heavier than ever. Not because of its weight, because of its witness. Because tonight its words had not been quoted. They had been lived. She stood slowly, knees stiff from stillness, and made her way back up to the pulpit. Not to speak, but to look. The sanctuary was empty, but it didn't feel that way. It felt watched. It felt remembered. The places where people had sat still hummed with what they had felt: shame, reverence, conviction. Jasmine rested her hand on the worn wood rail, the same spot where generations before her had prayed and wept, and said yes to callings they never asked for. She whispered, not to anyone else but to herself, "Let it be enough." Then she stepped down again, each footstep quiet, final, and sure. Back in the pew, she finally picked up her phone. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of messages. Her staff had likely left voicemails begging for her to say something, anything, but she didn't open them. Instead, she clicked into her browser and searched one thing: "Woman with Broken Cross, Dallas." The video had already gone viral again, this time posted by someone else. No captions, no edits. Just her, kneeling beside the homeless mother, handing her a blanket, holding the child's hand. 10 seconds long, 10 million views. She stared at the screen for a moment, then locked the phone and tucked it away. If the world had finally seen it, she didn't need to explain it. The truth didn't require a press release. It just needed witnesses. Behind her, the church doors creaked open. She turned, expecting a custodian, but it was an older man in a navy cap, holding it nervously in both hands. He stood in the doorway, hesitant. "I'm sorry," he said softly. I wanted to sit where my wife used to sit. I haven't been back in years." Jasmine nodded and stepped aside. "Row 3 on the right," she said, pointing gently. He walked down the aisle slowly, breathing in the scent of time and dust and memory. As he lowered himself onto the wooden bench, Jasmine watched him close his eyes, rest both hands on the pew in front of him, and whisper something too private to share. The moment didn't need words. The building had heard enough tonight to know when to be still. She walked quietly to the back door and paused, one hand on the worn brass handle. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet asphalt and honeysuckle. A single street lamp flickered above the sidewalk, like it wasn't quite ready to sleep. Jasmine stepped out into the night, Bible tucked beneath her arm. A young woman leaned against the side wall near the door, clutching a notebook, eyes wide. "Ms. Crockett," she said, almost breathless, "I came here tonight because my uncle said you were dangerous. But I think I just saw the only real sermon I've ever understood." Jasmine didn't laugh. She just smiled gently and replied, "Then maybe you were meant to hear it more than he was." They stood there for a moment, two women from different worlds, bound by something older than policy and deeper than belief. Not party, not protest, just presence. When Jasmine finally walked down the steps, her feet made no sound. And behind her, the young woman opened her notebook and wrote something at the top of the page: "Justice, not power." Because that night in Dallas, there were no headlines, no stage lights, no podiums, Just a woman who had carried the cross long before she wore it, and a city that, for the first time, followed. But long after the pews emptied and the rain dried from the sidewalk, something deeper remained. Not applause, not headlines, but a question that refused to go back to sleep. What do we really mean when we say we believe? What Jasmine Crockett taught us had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the cost of conviction. She didn't win with a soundbite. She didn't weaponize outrage or rehearse a takedown. What she did, what changed everything, was simply show up, steady and unshaken, in a room designed to unmake her. She stood not for attention, but for accountability. She didn't perform faith, she practiced it, and in doing so, revealed how many others had only mimicked its shadow. Her words were never about power, they were about responsibility, about the burden of carrying truth in a world that rewards noise over nuance. And when she said, "I wear this cross not to judge but to remind," it wasn't a line. It was a wound, quietly kept open so others could see themselves in it. Because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't speak louder, it's refuse to bend. This story forces us to confront a brutal reality, that moral language has been hijacked, polished, and sold back to us as a shield for cruelty. That faith is too often used to punch down instead of lift up. Jasmine didn't just call that out. She held up a mirror. She showed us a woman forced to give birth after rape. She showed us children left under bridges while politicians praised themselves for being pro-life. She showed us a broken cross on the neck of a homeless mother and asked us, "Is this what we meant to protect?" And in doing so, she stripped away the comfort of abstraction. These weren't talking points. These were people, flesh, bone, breath. It was no longer possible to pretend the debate was theoretical when the consequences had faces. The injustice Jasmine faced wasn't just political, it was spiritual exile. To be told by another lawmaker, in full view of the nation, that her cross was a lie, that her beliefs were invalid, that her skin and silence made her unworthy of faith. That wasn't debate. That was erasure. And she didn't return fire with fire. She returned it with something far more dangerous: stillness, truth, memory. She brought a Bible worn thin by her mother's hands and placed it next to Greene's gold crucifix. And the difference wasn't style, it was substance. One was polished for the camera, the other was cracked from use. One demanded submission, the other offered mercy. And the room, designed for control, had no defense for mercy in motion. The lesson is this: true belief is not about what you wear, it's about what you carry when the world tells you to drop it. Jasmine carried her faith into a room waiting to devour her. She carried it through disbelief, through mockery, through silence. And in doing so, she reminded us that belief is not the weapon, belief is the armor. Not to shield you from opposition, but to make sure you don't become what you're standing against. She could have burned the room down with outrage. She could have screamed, but she chose to outlast them, to outlisten them, to outlive their expectations of her. And that choice, that restraint, was the revolution. Her story teaches that justice without humility becomes vengeance, that policy without people becomes propaganda, and that the greatest threat to oppressive power is not always protest. Sometimes it's presence. Jasmine's power wasn't loud. It was unmovable. The kind of power you earn by showing up every day in systems designed to erase you and saying, "I'm still here," not for you, for them, for the child under the bridge, for the girl in the hospital, for the mother holding a bent cross who doesn't need a sermon, just someone to sit beside her and say, "I see you." This wasn't politics. This was gospel made flesh. But perhaps the most painful and necessary truth Jasmine's story reveals is this: that silence is never neutral. Every person in that hearing room who didn't speak, every lawmaker who looked away, every aide who took notes instead of taking a stand, they weren't just bystanders. They were barriers. Jasmine didn't just fight Greene. She fought the silence around her. And in breaking that silence, she gave the rest of us no excuse to remain comfortable. No more pretending we didn't know. No more hiding behind nuance. Because when someone speaks the truth so clearly, so gently, so completely, we are all on notice. We are all accountable to the silence we choose. The message that remains is not a slogan, it's a question. What are you willing to carry? Not where. Carry. When no one's watching, when it won't trend, when it might cost you something. Are you willing to carry a broken cross and sit with someone society's already discarded? Are you willing to love in public when it makes you vulnerable in private? Are you willing to walk into a room that hates your presence and choose not to hate back? Because that's what Jasmine did. And in doing so, she showed us not how to win an argument, but how to win a soul. The moment she stepped down from that pulpit wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a movement built not on anger, but alignment. Alignment with something quieter, truer. Her lesson was not a new one, but it had been forgotten. That mercy must come before law, that justice must be wrapped in compassion, or it's just control in disguise. That faith is not about the power to condemn, but the courage to comfort, and that the people we are told to fear are often the very people who carry grace without ever asking for credit. So if there is one thing left to say, it's this. Jasmine Crockett did not raise her voice. She raised the stakes, and in doing so, she left us with more than a quote or a clip. She left us with a choice. What cross will you carry? And will it be for power or for people? Because in the end, that is the only question that matters. And the answer will not be shouted, it will be lived. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In just 5 minutes, Jasmine Crockett shattered decades of silence in a live congressional hearing, confronting Senator Tim Scott face-to-face over a truth the nation had long avoided. Racially biased policing and secret policies that protect violent officers. When she unveiled a classified document on camera, the entire room fell silent. Tim Scott couldn't say a word. What followed split the media, shifted votes in Congress, and forced America to look in the mirror. Can one woman really change an entire system built to silence voices like hers? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The double doors of room 226 opened right on time, 8:30 a.m. sharp. What followed wasn't just another hearing. It felt heavier, like something that had been building for years. Reporters shuffled in quietly, scanning their notes. Staffers whispered as they took their seats. The marble walls felt colder than usual, and the seal of the United States Congress hung above the chairman's bench like a warning. This isn't politics as usual. This is Judgment Day. Cameras from every major network, C-SPAN, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, flashed their red lights. Everyone was watching. The country wasn't just paying attention. It was holding its breath. Chairman Holt leaned into his mic. His voice was calm, but everyone could hear the edge beneath it. This is the final hearing on the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act before it goes to the full House. A quiet wave moved through the room. Even those who had heard it coming for weeks still felt the weight of it now. 3 years of debate, delays, and watered-down proposals had come to this moment. A vote was coming, and the decision would shape how America policed its own citizens for generations. Jasmine Crockett sat at one end of the table, composed but tense. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white. She didn't need to look around to feel the room watching her. They always watched her, but rarely listened. Across from her was Senator Tim Scott, carefully adjusting the gold pin on his lapel. His expression was unreadable, but Jasmine could see it in his eyes. He came prepared to push back. They weren't just two lawmakers. They were two symbols, two sides of a fight that had split the country wide open. Jasmine wore a simple dark blazer, no jewelry except a small silver ring, engraved with the initials J.A., her cousin, Jamal Anderson, shot by police at a traffic stop. They said they thought he had a weapon. He was 17. She never forgot. She never forgave. Tim Scott looked polished in his navy suit, papers neatly stacked in front of him. He wasn't here to deny pain, but he believed change had to come slowly, carefully, without tearing down what he saw as the foundation of order. Jasmine didn't see order. She saw a system that chose silence over justice. The chairman spoke again. Each of you will have 5 minutes for your opening statements. Jasmine inhaled once, slow and deep. 5 minutes. That's all she had to speak for the names etched into protest signs, for the parents who never got answers, for the kids who learned early what it meant to be watched, feared, punished. She wasn't here to play safe. She was here because someone had to say what others wouldn't. Tim Scott leaned forward slightly, pen in hand. He was ready for a debate. Jasmine wasn't. She was ready for a reckoning. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. But inside, Jasmine could feel the weight of the moment coiling tighter, like a spring wound to the edge. The chairman had barely finished his sentence when Tim Scott leaned forward, pressed the button on his mic, and began to speak. Not with anger, but with control. The kind of control honed through years in halls like this. The kind that sounded calm, even when it was about to dismiss someone else's reality. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," he began. "Let me start by saying what many of us already know. The overwhelming majority of police officers in this country, 99%, wake up every day to serve and protect. They don't wake up looking to harm anyone." There it was, the number. 99%. Clean, reassuring, sanitized. Jasmine's jaw tensed, but she didn't interrupt. Not yet. Tim's voice was steady, measured, deliberate. "Do we have problems? Yes. Do we have work to do? Absolutely. But let's not throw gasoline on the fire by tearing down the very institutions that keep our neighborhoods safe. We don't need to defund the police. We need to fund better training, better tools, better oversight." He paused for effect, scanning the room. "We don't fix the system by dismantling it. We fix it by investing in it. Because reform, real reform, means supporting those who put on the badge and take the risk every single day." Applause didn't break out, but a few nods moved down the Republican bench. To them, it sounded reasonable, rational, balanced. But to Jasmine, it sounded like denial wrapped in a velvet ribbon. Because behind that 1% he mentioned so casually lay graves. Dozens of them, hundreds, thousands. Some never even got names. The room was still digesting his words when Jasmine shifted. It was subtle, just a lean, a breath, but it hit like a shift in air pressure before a storm. No one told her to speak. She didn't ask. She stood, not slowly, not theatrically. She rose the way someone does when they've waited too long to sit still. Her chair scraped back against the marble floor with a sharp, unfiltered sound that cut through the silence like a blade. All eyes turned to her, not out of curiosity, but instinct. Something had changed. Something was about to be said that no one could ignore. She stepped forward, her voice low but clear enough to carve through stone. 1%, she repeated, not as a question, but as a warning. 1% of officers with the power to kill an innocent person without consequence means the other 99% lose all meaning. The words didn't echo. They landed. Heavy, hard, final. The room went quiet. The kind of quiet that follows something undeniable. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words carried weight because they came from truth, not volume. She looked directly at Senator Scott, then scanned the dais. We are not talking about paperwork errors. We're talking about bodies, people, children, men with wallets mistaken for weapons, women killed in their sleep, mothers with empty arms and no closure. Her hands were still at her sides, but her entire body seemed to speak. If even 1% of airplanes crashed, we'd ground the fleet. If 1% of surgeons killed patients on the table, we'd shut down hospitals. But with policing, we argue over funding while families bury their sons. She paused, not for drama, for air, for restraint, for control, and then quieter. So no, Senator. 99% is not good enough. If 1% can murder without justice. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched, thick, tense, electric. Even the cameras seemed to lean in, as if the room itself had stopped breathing. But then, Tim Scott reached for his stack of papers. He didn't raise his voice either. He didn't need to. His power was in the numbers, in the illusion of neutrality. With all due respect, he began, pressing one finger to the top sheet, the data tells a fuller story. His voice was calm, professional, even empathetic, but behind the tone was something colder. Control, not dominance, not rage, just control. It was the kind of voice people trusted on TV, the kind of voice that made uncomfortable truths sound negotiable. He sat upright, spine straight, shoulders set, and continued. According to a DOJ review of 2023 arrest records, use of force incidents have actually declined by 17% nationwide. Black Americans make up 13% of the population, but in most urban departments, force is applied at rates proportionate to the crime index. He paused there, not to breathe, but to let the numbers settle. As if they were enough, as if they explained everything. No one interrupted him. No one looked satisfied either. The room had grown colder somehow, brighter, as if the facts themselves had drained the human weight out of the air. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't look away, but something behind her eyes tightened, a flash of disbelief so sharp it could cut steel. Tim didn't flinch. He went on, flipping to the next page like a teacher reviewing a lesson. These are facts, not feelings. We have to be careful not to confuse injustice with anecdote. The words fell with soft edges but heavy intent. They were meant to sound wise, measured, mature. But to those who had lived on the wrong end of a badge, they sounded like sandpaper against the truth. Still, he kept going. In a 2024 study by the National Police Foundation, he continued, lifting the next document slightly for effect, 82% of surveyed officers reported receiving implicit bias training, and over 90% passed standardized accountability reviews. That's progress. Another pause, another look across the room. His eyes met Jasmine's now, steady and unshaken. It may not be perfect, but we are not a nation of systemic racists. We are a nation working toward balance. He let that final sentence land slowly, like a closing door. He folded his hands and sat back, confident he had done what he came to do. Calm the fire with charts, replace grief with graphs. For some in the room, it worked. For others, it only made the silence heavier. Because numbers don't cry. Numbers don't bleed. Numbers don't knock on a mother's door at 2:13 a.m. to say her son won't be coming home. As Tim Scott's final words faded, we are a nation working toward balance. Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still for a beat longer than anyone expected. Long enough to let his message hang in the air. Long enough for people to think maybe she'd nod, maybe she'd respond politely, maybe she'd move on. She didn't. Instead, she leaned forward, slow and deliberate, like someone who wasn't just responding to an argument, but loading live ammunition. Her hands moved with a strange, eerie calm, like she'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind, but waited for just the right silence to fire it. And then, something no one expected. She smiled, not wide, not kind. It was the smallest, tightest curve of her lips. A smile that didn't say, "Thank you for your point," but rather, "You just walked into it." "Senator Scott," she said, her voice quiet, composed, almost gentle, "you forgot one statistic, the one you didn't publish." Every head turned, cameras locked in, staffers froze mid-gesture. Even the chairman sat back in his seat with a barely concealed alertness. Jasmine turned to her laptop, already connected to the main display. Her fingers moved with confidence, no hesitation, no theatrics, just purpose. She clicked once, then once more, and the large screen behind the dais came to life. A file opened. Black background, white text. June 4th, 2024, Columbia, South Carolina. Body cam footage, internal review file. She tapped the spacebar. The room fell silent as the video began. First static, then a jump cut to raw body cam footage. The scene was disorienting. Loud voices, shaky movement, flashing lights from a gas station canopy overhead. A black man, mid-30s, hands raised, backing away slowly, confused but not aggressive. One officer shouted, "Get down!" Another screamed, "Stop resisting!" before the man had moved an inch. Then came the takedown, fast, violent. Two officers. One drove a knee into the man's back, the other pushed his face into the pavement. Then, the knee shifted higher, onto his neck. 17 seconds passed, then 20, then 32. His breathing became erratic. His voice cracked, panicked, strained, calling for air. I can't, and then nothing. His body stopped moving. His eyes were open but lifeless, and the footage kept going. The officers stood, walked away. No CPR, no panic, just silence. The room cracked. A sharp gasp rippled across the hearing chamber, first from a young aide seated near the back, then from a veteran representative who instinctively reached for his glasses like they could shield him from what he'd just seen. Several people physically recoiled. Someone whispered, "Oh my God," but the mic didn't pick it up. Reporters began typing so fast the sound of keys became its own rhythm. No one tried to interrupt. No one dared. The screen went dark. Jasmine turned back toward the room, but her focus was laser-locked on one person, Tim Scott. Her voice was clear now, controlled. But beneath it was something harder, sharper, pain that had been ground into steel. "That was Marcus Lane," she said calmly. 36 years old, father of two. Wrong place. No weapon. No charges. She let it sink in. A few people instinctively glanced down at their notes, as if afraid to meet her eyes. Others couldn't look away. "And no statement from your office. Not even after we sent the footage directly to your staff." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every syllable hit like a hammer wrapped in velvet. Her hands were still, her posture steady, her presence unshakable. "You want to talk data?" she said, her voice narrowing like a scalpel. "That was your district. That was your silence." And just like that, the entire dynamic shifted. The statistics were gone. The talking points were dust. Now there was only the truth, raw, on tape, and undeniable. The room was still spinning from the footage when Jasmine inhaled, slow, deliberate, like someone forcing herself to keep breathing in a space that had stolen air from her lungs more than once. The silence hadn't broken. The cameras were still blinking. Phones were still buzzing in coat pockets. But Jasmine's voice returned, not louder, not faster, just heavier, weighted, controlled like the steady pull of gravity before something drops. And this time, she didn't point to the screen. She pointed to her own past. "You want to talk about patterns?" she asked, her voice low but unmistakably sharp. She wasn't raising a question. She was drawing a line. "Then let me give you one that doesn't come from a spreadsheet." Her eyes didn't scan the room. She focused straight ahead, as if the story was too real to risk diffusing it across too many faces. She pressed her fingertips against the table, grounding herself, steadying the memory before releasing it. "My uncle, his name was Terrence Crockett, was walking home from his second shift at the mill when two officers pulled up and demanded to see his ID. Her voice didn't waver, but something behind it did, like a bruise being touched again for the first time in years. He asked one question, just one. She raised her hand, palm out, slow and calm, like she was replaying it frame by frame. "What did I do wrong?" That's all he said. A beat passed. No one moved. No one could. Some looked down instinctively, sensing what was coming next but not knowing how to brace for it. "And for that," she continued, "they slammed his head into the hood of the cruiser, broke 3 ribs, ruptured a disc in his spine." The words didn't rise. They fell, hard and cold and irrefutable. She didn't look for sympathy. She wasn't asking for it. She was documenting it. "He never walked the same again. He still can't tie his own shoes." One or two staffers shifted uncomfortably. A representative on the far side of the room blinked slowly, lips slightly parted, suddenly unsure how anyone could pivot from this. Jasmine let the silence come again, but not for long. "We filed a complaint," she said, now pulling a thick manila folder from her bag. It was frayed around the corners, stained near the edges, overstuffed and bent like it had been carried too many times without ever being opened. "Sent it to Internal Affairs. Sent it to the State Attorney General." She held it up not like evidence, but like a wound. 7 years. The words hung like a sentence. A life sentence, really. 7 years of silence, of letters unanswered, of evidence ignored, of this case being passed around like a virus no one wanted to catch. Then, without drama, she dropped the file flat onto the table. The sound wasn't loud, but in the room's breathless stillness, it echoed, not just off the walls, but in people's throats, in their conscience. "That's the justice some of us are told to believe in," she said, voice now sharpened like a courtroom blade. "That's the system some of you are here to protect." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words had already raised the stakes higher than anyone expected, and higher than anyone, especially Tim Scott, could safely walk back from. The folder Jasmine dropped still sat on the table, like a silent brick of truth, undeniable, unmoved, unforgotten. Around it, no one made a sound. Even the rustling of notes and the subtle hum of electronics seemed to vanish. Across the table, Tim Scott sat still, his hands clasped tightly together, eyes fixed not on Jasmine, not on the cameras, but on something internal. His throat moved just slightly. He wasn't flipping pages anymore. He wasn't pointing at data. He wasn't defending a policy or quoting a report. For several long seconds, Tim Scott was just a son remembering. Then finally he raised his eyes. There was no smirk, no strategy, just stillness. He spoke slowly, without a script. "My mother," he began, "was robbed at knife point when I was 9 years old." The words dropped gently, but they didn't fall flat. They shifted the room in a different way, not with fire, but with something more unexpected. Vulnerability. He looked at no one in particular, as if the story lived outside the walls of the hearing room, somewhere back in time, somewhere it never stopped playing. "It was just before Christmas," he continued, the corner of his mouth tightening with memory. "She was working the closing shift at the diner, walking to the bus stop when a man grabbed her from behind and pressed a knife to her neck." No one moved. Jasmine didn't interrupt. Not because she agreed, but because something deeper was happening. A wound was being shown, and wounds, especially the real ones, command a certain kind of silence. "She managed to scream," he said, eyes narrowing with the image, "and a patrol car, parked down the block, heard her. They were there in less than 20 seconds. They tackled him. They got the knife away. She came home that night, shaking, crying, but alive." His voice didn't tremble, but it wasn't smooth either. It was a voice that carried dust, time, reality. He let the silence return, not for dramatic effect, but because it was necessary. The weight of the memory demanded space, and when he finally spoke again, it was with a kind of plain-spoken truth that made even the cameras seem to back off. "And for me, the badge meant safety. It meant someone would come when you screamed." That was it. No argument, no denial, no erasure of Jasmine's pain. Just another truth, laid bare. But that single sentence, "it meant someone would come when you screamed," sat in the air like a dividing line between two Americas. One where protection arrived in 20 seconds, and another where 7 years of paperwork still hadn't brought a single response. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't challenged her facts. But in those quiet, unwavering words, Tim Scott exposed the sharpest difference of all. Not belief, not ideology, but experience. And that difference was enough to shake the room all over again. The room had barely begun to recover from the quiet war of memories between Jasmine and Tim when it happened. Sudden, sharp, and completely tone-deaf. A conservative congressman seated near the edge of the dais shifted in his chair and leaned forward toward his mic. His name wasn't important, but his smirk was. He adjusted his cuff as if preparing for a press conference, not a reckoning. He had been quiet through most of the hearing, arms folded, occasionally sighing, clearly irritated by the emotional weight in the room. But now he had decided it had gone too far. Or maybe, from where he sat, it had never meant anything at all. And so, with the careless confidence of someone who'd never been followed by a patrol car without reason, he said it. "If you're not happy with the police," he said flatly, "you're free to move somewhere else." The words didn't just break the silence. They violated it, like a car alarm going off in a church. The effect was instant. Several heads snapped toward him. A staffer near the media box instinctively let out a quiet, "What?" under her breath. One of the younger aides closed his laptop a little too hard, trying not to react visibly. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The insult didn't surprise her. It never did. What made this moment different was that it was spoken into a microphone, on the record, under the seal of Congress, in a hearing meant to address the death of a man who couldn't breathe. Her face didn't twist. She didn't raise her eyebrows. Her response was not theatrical, it was ancestral. A different kind of weight moved through her body, and with a sudden, thunderous bang, her palms slammed flat against the table. The sound echoed, short, sharp, final. A few papers jumped. A glass near the stenographer vibrated audibly. Even the cameras, those emotionless eyes blinking red, seemed to flinch. She stood up so quickly, the chair behind her slid an inch across the floor. She didn't lean toward the mic. She didn't need to. Her voice carried like something that had been waiting too long to speak. "I was born here," she said, each word as grounded as stone. "I'm not a guest." Her tone wasn't loud, but it was exact. It carried the weight of generations who had been told to go somewhere else after building the very nation they were being asked to leave. No one moved, not even the congressman who had spoken. He leaned back slightly now, blinking like he hadn't expected the table to hit back. From across the horseshoe, Tim Scott exhaled, a long, visible breath, like someone watching a fire approach a line of gasoline. He didn't reach for his papers. He didn't check his phone. He just leaned forward and said quietly, without challenge, without bite, "Don't let emotion kill reason." It wasn't an attack. It was something else. Fatigue, perhaps. A plea. An echo of the belief that if everyone stayed calm, maybe something could be salvaged. But in that moment, it only made the divide sharper. Jasmine turned to him, slowly. Her expression didn't harden. It deepened, like someone who had looked reason in the eye once and found nothing there. Her stare was still. Her voice, lower now, came out like a slow drum beat pulled from the ground. "I saw blood before I ever saw reason." And with that, everything stopped. There were no gasps, no keyboard clacks, only stillness. Because everyone in the room, for one terrifying second, understood. This wasn't just a policy debate. This was what it felt like when history stepped into the room and refused to sit down. The tension in the chamber had thickened to the point of suffocation. Jasmine's words, "I saw blood before I ever saw reason," were still vibrating in the bones of everyone present, like the final chord of a requiem refusing to fade. The chairman hadn't banged his gavel. The cameras hadn't blinked away. And no one, not even the congressman who suggested she leave the country, had dared to speak again. It was Jasmine who moved first, but she didn't shout. She didn't flinch. She opened a manila folder with the same calm as someone lighting a match in a room full of gas. "This hearing has heard statistics, personal stories, claims of bias and claims of progress," she said, her voice steady, unshaken. "But there's one thing we haven't heard yet. Truth from the inside." She pulled out a thin document, stamped restricted, the kind of stamp that screams louder than any headline. She held it in the air, not for effect, but for accountability. "This is a leaked internal memo from the FBI's Civil Rights Division, dated February 2025. Her tone darkened by a degree, sharp enough to quiet even the reporters now hovering at the edge of their seats. It outlines that 27% of police departments surveyed admitted to having an informal, unwritten policy of not pursuing internal investigations into racial violence by officers, especially when the victims are Black or Latino. Gasps erupted, some muffled, some sharp. The chairman leaned forward, as if uncertain whether to intervene or take notes. Staffers froze mid-gesture. One aide dropped his pen. Jasmine placed the report on the witness table, then turned to the screen behind her. The red lights of the media cameras blinked in perfect rhythm, as if keeping time with the unraveling of a system no longer able to hide. She clicked once. The screen behind her illuminated with the memo's header. Confidential, FBI Field Report, Internal Compliance and Ethics Trends in Urban Police Agencies. Below that, paragraph after paragraph of sobering language appeared. Retaliation for reporting racial bias appears not only tolerated, but structurally enabled in nearly 1/3 of departments surveyed. Jasmine didn't need to explain it. The document spoke for itself. "We talk about bad apples," she said, now facing the room again. "But what do you call it when the orchard is designed to bury the roots?" Tim Scott leaned forward, his face unreadable, jaw clenched. For the first time, he looked like someone trying to choose his words as carefully as someone crossing a frozen lake. "That document," he said slowly, "is deeply concerning, but it represents behavior, individual behavior, not policy, not intent. These are isolated cases, not systemic doctrine. We can't conflate isolated misconduct with the entire institution. That would be unjust to the many departments doing it right." The response sounded reasonable, at least on paper. It was calm, measured, like a lifeline tossed into a storm. But Jasmine didn't reach for it. She took a breath, not to calm down, but to steady the truth in her chest. "Isolated?" she repeated softly, then turned back to her laptop. Click. A new slide filled the screen. 5 states, 15 incidents, identical outcomes. California, Texas, Georgia, Illinois, Pennsylvania. Each listed with the date of the complaint, the name of the victim, the department involved, and a chillingly identical final note. "No internal investigation pursued. Case closed with no officer reprimanded. Victim cited for noncompliance." Click. Now the screen showed faces, photos of the victims. Some were mugshots, others were social media pictures cropped from birthday cakes and graduations. Young men, older women, one boy who looked no older than 12, all black, all filed reports. None received justice. Jasmine stepped aside, letting the screen speak in silence for a moment longer. "I didn't make this list up," she said finally. "These are from DOJ records and civil lawsuits that never made it past discovery because the officers in question were shielded by qualified immunity, or worse, internal silence." She turned back to Scott, her eyes unwavering. "Tell me, is it still isolated when 5 separate states, under 5 different governors, show the same pattern? Same phrasing? Same buried reports?" Scott didn't speak immediately. He didn't have to. The room said it for him. The pattern wasn't hidden anymore. It was on display. It had names, dates, faces. Jasmine's voice dropped, not in volume, but in weight. "This isn't about hating the police. This is about naming the silence." "And silence," she said, tapping the report with a single finger, "has a structure." Reporters were no longer writing. They were filming live. Twitter feeds exploded outside the chamber. Structured silence began trending within 4 minutes. On the House feed, viewers flooded the comments with names. "Say his name. Say her name." And one sentence began spreading like wildfire across news sites. "We talk about bad apples, but what do you call it when the orchard is designed to bury the roots?" Inside the room, the atmosphere was no longer just tense. It was transformed. No one was thinking about 5-minute speaking limits or polite yield of time exchanges. What Jasmine had laid bare wasn't just misconduct, it was method. Not just pain, but pattern. And in that moment, the hearing had crossed a line it couldn't walk back from. And yet, even as the hearing room stood tense and still, the real eruption wasn't happening inside those walls. It was happening outside them. Jasmine Crockett's final words had barely faded before the first clips began circulating. 30-second video snippets, cut from the live broadcast and uploaded to social media with captions that bled emotion. "I saw blood before I ever saw reason. I was born here. I'm not a guest." In less than 10 minutes, 2 hashtags began rising. First slowly, then like a tidal wave smashing every timeline. "Let her speak" and "Back the blue." By the top of the hour, both were trending nationally. By the end of the day, they were being spoken aloud in newsrooms, classrooms, coffee shops, and war rooms on both sides of the aisle. "Let her speak" became a rallying cry for those demanding police reform, accountability, and space for voices like Jasmine's. Black, female, unafraid. Her supporters flooded social platforms with videos of her testimony, excerpts of the FBI memo, and images of Marcus Lane and the folder she had dropped with surgical precision. It wasn't just politics now. It was personal. But at the exact same time, Back the Blue was surging too. fueled by conservative influencers, police unions, and law and order politicians warning against what they called emotional sabotage of institutional stability. They clipped Tim Scott's calm responses and pushed sound bites like, "Don't let emotion kill reason," as proof that restraint, not passion, was the adult in the room. For every clip of Jasmine slamming her hand on the table, there was a stitched video calling it radical theater. Two realities, two truths, one boiling country. Television didn't wait long to join the fight. That evening, CNN opened its primetime coverage with a chilling headline. 27% of departments look the other way. Jasmine Crockett demands justice. Meanwhile, Fox News ran with, "Outburst on the Hill, Crockett versus Reason. Is Congress listening to chaos?" On MSNBC, the leaked FBI memo was front and center, read aloud with grainy footage of the victims Jasmine named. On Newsmax, a guest host claimed the document was questionable at best, and that Crockett was dismantling public trust for retweets. No one aired the full hearing. Every outlet chose moments. The clips that made their case, confirmed their narrative, moved their base, and the base was moving, fast. In Chicago, a spontaneous rally formed in front of a federal courthouse, dozens holding signs with Jasmine's face and the words "not a guest, a citizen." In Dallas, a crowd gathered near a local police department with banners reading, "Justice means action, not apologies." At the same time, a counter-protest was forming in Raleigh, where a line of supporters wearing American flag gear waved thin blue line flags and chanted, "Protect those who protect us." The divide wasn't coming, it was already here, and Congress felt it like a noose tightening around the vote count. By morning, the inboxes of dozens of representatives, especially those from swing districts, were overflowing. Thousands of emails, voicemails, comments, demands, threats, pleas. Constituents who had never written a lawmaker before were now flooding their elected officials with messages that started with, "I saw the video," or, "After yesterday, I need to know where you stand." Chiefs of staff were pulling extra interns just to triage the onslaught. Behind closed doors, the conversation began to change. Some moderate Democrats who had quietly planned to abstain from the vote on the George Floyd Act were now reconsidering. "I didn't expect this to explode like that." Republicans who had once dismissed the bill as symbolic suddenly faced a public relations nightmare. Town halls were being rescheduled, fundraisers were being paused. The phones just wouldn't stop ringing. One staffer from a Midwestern Republican's office, speaking off record, admitted, "We thought we could sit this one out." Now our own base is split. Half are shouting, "Back the blue," and the other half are asking why Tim Scott had no answer for that FBI memo. Internally, party strategists began circulating data showing that black voter turnout was climbing steadily online, even in red counties. Donors on both sides started calling, not to offer money, but to ask for answers. In real time, politicians began issuing new statements, not apologies, repositionings. Language like, "We continue to evaluate the bill with great seriousness," replaced previous tweets calling it anti-police. One congressman who'd previously said, "We don't negotiate with activists," quietly deleted the tweet, and by noon had posted, "Every voice deserves to be heard." I look forward to reviewing all aspects of the George Floyd Act with my colleagues. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was a signal. The hearing had changed something, not just what people believed, but what they were willing to say aloud. And at the center of it all was a woman in a charcoal blazer, standing in a room where she had not just spoken, but shifted the room's gravity. Jasmine, for her part, said nothing to the press. She walked past reporters with the same posture she had in the chamber. Steady, measured, unbothered by the storm because she had already walked through the fire. But across every news app in America, her image was there. The quote was there. The line was there. "I was born here. I'm not a guest." And just beneath it, in different fonts and colors depending on your screen, "Let her speak back." The blue two sides of the same country, watching the same moment and seeing something very different. But just when it seemed the room had absorbed the worst of the storm, the door at the back of the chamber creaked open, slowly, without announcement, without pretense. The timing was strange. The chairman glanced toward his aide, confused. There was no one else scheduled to speak, but the man who entered walked with purpose, not hesitation. He was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, but not threatening. His suit was modest. His eyes, red around the edges, scanned the room not with defiance, but with something closer to guilt. A whisper moved through the chamber like a current. One staffer leaned into another and mouthed, "Who is that?" Jasmine's eyes narrowed. She'd never seen him before. Neither had Tim Scott. But the chairman, after glancing at a last-minute note placed in front of him, cleared his throat and said quietly, "Mr. Derek Callahan, former officer of the Arlington Police Department, has requested to make a personal statement. He is the final witness for today." A few members shifted. The air changed again. Callahan stepped up to the microphone. He didn't have papers, no binder, just shaking hands and a face that looked like it hadn't slept in weeks. He took a deep breath, let it out slow, and then began. Not like someone delivering testimony, but like someone trying to drag a truth out of his own chest before it choked him. "I was a cop for 18 years, he said. 2 different departments. No write-ups, no lawsuits. I got promoted. People trusted me." Silence. "And I thought I was one of the good ones." His voice cracked slightly at that last word. "I told myself that every day. Even when I looked away from things. Even when I laughed at the jokes other guys made in the locker room. Even when I let a black teenager cry in the back seat of my cruiser because I followed protocol." No one moved. "I want to tell you something I was never supposed to say out loud," he continued, eyes locked straight ahead. We were trained, to see black men as threats. That's not in the handbook. That's not official, but it's real. I was told that if a black man runs, assume he's guilty. If he talks back, assume he's dangerous. If he twitches, assume he's armed. He swallowed hard, and then came the sentence that broke the room. I was taught that being black meant being a threat. A few people audibly gasped. Someone near the back dropped a pen. Even the stenographer paused mid-keystroke. Callahan's voice trembled now, but he didn't stop. I carried that into every traffic stop, every sidewalk encounter, every time I touched my radio. And I didn't know how wrong it was until the day I cuffed a 14-year-old boy outside a gas station for looking at me too long. He cried the whole time. He was holding Skittles. Jasmine's eyes welled, but she didn't blink. She didn't look down. She just watched. Every word this man said landed like an arrow into the truth she had been trying to make them see for years. Callahan took another breath, but it broke halfway through. His voice collapsed with it. I left the force 2 years ago. I started therapy. I don't sleep much. My kids ask me what I did for a living, and I changed the subject. Then he looked up, right at Jasmine. I watched you today, he said, and I want to say something I never got to say to the kids I pulled over. Or their parents, or that boy with the Skittles. A pause, his voice was raw. I'm sorry. That's when Jasmine's tears finally fell. Not because she hadn't heard stories like this before, but because it had never been spoken like this, in this room, by someone who had worn the badge. She wiped her cheek once, quickly, and stayed standing. Across the table, Tim Scott looked down, his hands folded tightly, the corners of his mouth trembling slightly. There was no political response for this, no pivot, no calculation, only quiet. And then, without instruction, the entire chamber rose. One by one they stood, Democrats, Republicans, interns, committee clerks, even the reporters in the back. Not clapping, not speaking, just standing. The kind of silence that says, we heard you, the kind that doesn't need permission. Callahan stepped back from the mic. He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He just nodded once, wiped his own face, and walked out the same way he entered. Quietly, no cameras chasing, no titles attached. But the impact remained. It hung in the air like a final chord that no one wanted to mute. And Jasmine? She stayed standing too, hands still, breath slow, eyes fixed on the empty microphone. Because for the first time in the entire hearing, someone else had said it for her. The silence after the former officer's confession lingered long after he left the room. Even as people slowly sat down, the gravity didn't dissipate. It thickened, settled into the bones of everyone present. Jasmine remained standing for a moment longer, breathing in slow, measured beats, as if giving the room one last second to process what had just happened. Then quietly she sat. Across the table, Tim Scott did the same. He didn't speak right away. Neither did she. For once, the stillness between them didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like something else, something closer to recognition. Not agreement, but acknowledgement. The chairman cleared his throat, unsure how to continue, when Tim finally leaned forward. His voice was low but direct. "I believe in accountability," he said. "I always have. But today made it clear. We need stronger tools to ensure it." Jasmine looked at him, not with suspicion, not with warmth either, but with the weary caution of someone who's seen promises come and go. "What tools?" she asked plainly. Tim didn't hesitate. "Mandatory body cameras, not just funded, required. Every officer, every shift, no exceptions." A few heads in the room turned. That wasn't nothing. Jasmine studied his face, searching for hesitation. There was none, so she replied, not with emotion, but with precision. "An oversight," she said. "Cameras mean nothing without independent review. I want a federal monitor for departments that fail accountability audits. Someone who doesn't answer to their chain of command." Tim exhaled, nodded once. "Independent oversight," he repeated. "I can accept that." That was the first crack in the wall between them. Jasmine shifted in her chair, eyes narrowing slightly. Not in challenge, but in calculation. "Then I'll make a concession," she said. "Your community policing program, the pilot you've been pushing for 2 years in South Carolina, I'll support its inclusion in the bill, but with civilian review baked in. No blank checks." Tim blinked, surprised but not displeased. "That's non-negotiable," he replied. "Civilians will be at the table from the start." Another silence followed, but this time it wasn't tense. It was active. The kind of silence where gears begin to move. Around the room, staffers began whispering. Aides pulled up shared language drafts. The chairman leaned back, eyebrows raised. "Are you telling me," he said, half incredulous, "you two just found common ground?" Jasmine spoke before Tim could. "We didn't agree," she said flatly. "We built a trench wide enough to meet in the middle." Tim nodded. "We're still standing on different sides," he added, "but we're not throwing rocks anymore." And with that, the impossible began to take shape. A new version of the bill emerged on paper within hours. It didn't carry Jasmine's full vision. It didn't reflect Tim's perfect ideal. But it did include mandatory body-worn cameras for all federal and local officers receiving federal funds, with clear disciplinary frameworks for failure to record use of force interactions. It included independent oversight boards, selected in part by civil rights organizations, to audit departments that fail annual bias or misconduct assessments. It retained Tim Scott's community partnership training program, but added citizen accountability layers, transparency reporting, and performance metrics that would be published publicly. Neither side got everything, but both got something worth defending. Still, the tension remained. Jasmine sat with the draft for nearly an hour, reviewing each line like a contract written in scars. She circled a clause that allowed for data to be sealed in ongoing investigations and pushed for an amendment to limit that clause to 30 days. Tim pushed back gently, asking for 60. They met at 45. She pushed again for trauma-informed training to be expanded to include not just active officers, but academy recruits. He agreed, but insisted on a provision that no officer could be decertified solely on unverified accusations. Jasmine frowned, then added a clause, unless a pattern is found across 3 or more cases. Another nod. It was a brutal kind of compromise, but it was real. By nightfall, the first joint statement was drafted, short, measured, and shocking in its very existence. "We do not agree on everything, but we agree that inaction is no longer an option. This bill is a first step toward rebuilding trust and protecting lives." Representative Jasmine Crockett and Senator Tim Scott. The statement hit the news before midnight. Some activists were furious. "Not strong enough, Ciorena," they said. "Where's the justice for past victims?" Some conservatives accused Tim of folding to pressure. But in the middle, The messy, angry, aching middle. Something remarkable was happening. Members of both parties who had refused to be in the same room the day before were now reviewing the joint proposal. Cautiously, reluctantly. But they were reading it. And Jasmine? She sat in her office past 2 a.m., staring out at the Capitol dome glowing in the dark like a hollow promise. She didn't smile. She didn't relax. But she did close her laptop slowly and whisper to herself, more prayer than victory. Not everything, but maybe enough. It happened in near silence. The final votes came in one by one. Green and red lights blinking across the digital board above the speaker's dais like the pulse of a divided nation. Members sat forward in their chairs, some whispering prayers, others clutching note cards like lifelines. Staffers hovered near the edge of the gallery, phones in hand, ready to post the moment the numbers locked. Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the screen, her face still, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles blanched. Tim Scott, seated 3 rows behind, leaned forward on his elbows, eyes narrowed, not in victory, but in waiting. Then came the final count, a narrow line, 217 to 213. For a moment, no one breathed. Then the speaker's voice cut through the air like a gavel made of thunder. The motion passes. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, amended, has been adopted by the House. The chamber broke into fragmented applause. Not a roar, more like an exhale from people who had been holding it for too long. Reporters raced to file stories before the ink dried. Phones lit up across the country. The crawl on CNN read, "Breaking House passes historic policing reform after heated negotiations." On MSNBC, a new era of accountability begins. And on Fox, controversial reform bill squeaks through the House. Outside, crowds gathered in front of Capitol Hill erupted in cheers, some with tears, others waving signs that said, "Justice isn't charity, and this is just the start." But inside, at the heart of it all, Jasmine Crockett remained seated. Her jaw was clenched, her eyes glassy but unshed. When a reporter shouted from the gallery, "Congresswoman Crockett, is this a victory?" She didn't answer right away. She stood slowly, walked up to the podium, and let the silence settle around her one last time before she spoke. "Changing laws is the easy part," she said, her voice even, sharp as cut glass. "But laws don't bleed. People do. And until the hearts behind the badges, behind the benches, behind the microphones, until those hearts change, this isn't justice. This is just paperwork." The room froze again. Some clapped. Most just listened, because the truth didn't need volume. It just needed someone willing to say it without blinking. "Don't call this the end of a chapter," she continued. "Call it the start of a harder one." Then she stepped back. No smile, no handshake, just truth, dropped like a gavel of her own. Across the room, Tim Scott rose too. He didn't head for the cameras. He didn't make a statement. He simply gathered his binder, adjusted his lapel, and started walking toward the exit. No entourage, no pageantry. But his steps were slow, measured. The kind of walk of a man who knows he helped build something, only to realize it's nowhere near finished. As he passed the empty front bench where Callahan had stood, he glanced once at the chair, then quickly looked away. Jasmine didn't follow him with her eyes. She didn't need to. She knew where he stood. She knew he'd carry this day on his shoulders for longer than any news cycle. Above them, on the gallery wall, the words carved into the marble watched like a warning. Equal justice under law. But both of them knew what the cameras would never catch. The law had moved, but the country had not. Outside the chamber, a crowd had already begun chanting. Some cried, some danced, some simply stared up at the Capitol with the weary hope of people who've been let down before. Journalists flooded the rotunda. Headlines were being written faster than votes had been cast. One read, "Jasmine Crockett, from witness to architect of reform." Another countered, "Scott and Crockett find fragile compromise in historic bill." But none captured the moment better than Jasmine's own words, already being quoted, stitched, tweeted, and turned into protest signs. "Changing laws is not enough. if the heart hasn't changed. And inside, as the last members filed out, the chamber stood still. Not in triumph, not in relief, but in something harder to name, a fragile beginning made of paper, pain, and just enough courage to keep going. And even after the final gavel dropped, the marble chamber did not breathe. The bill had passed, barely. The vote count had lit up the digital screen like an exhausted heartbeat. 217 to 213. It was over. On paper. But paper doesn't bleed. Paper doesn't remember the names. And as the members filed out, their suits sharp, their press releases ready, Jasmine Crockett remained still. Not frozen, anchored. Somewhere deep in her chest, she felt the quiet ache of a woman who had just dragged truth into the light and was still unsure if the country had truly looked. She didn't celebrate. She didn't pose. She didn't even speak to reporters lining the hall. She just walked. Down the steps of the Capitol, past the velvet ropes and bulletproof glass, past the tourists who whispered her name like a question, past the aides who smiled too politely. She moved like someone carrying a weight no headline could measure. Like someone who knew that signing a bill didn't fix a country that had been sick for 400 years. She walked alone. Her heels echoed across the concrete like seconds ticking on borrowed time. It was almost midnight. The sky above D.C. was a dark, soft blue, like a bruise fading in reverse. And somewhere in the distance, the echo of the crowd still murmured. The hashtags were still climbing. Number, let her speak. Justice takes time. We saw her. But Jasmine didn't check her phone. She didn't need to. The real reckoning wasn't digital. It was spiritual. It was inside. She turned down a side corridor, toward a statue she passed often but rarely looked at. Mary McLeod Bethune, cast in bronze, one hand clutching a cane, the other reaching out. Jasmine stopped, faced her, and whispered, "I'm trying." That was the truth. She wasn't celebrating. She was surviving. Because what this country calls progress, women like her have always had to drag, step by step, through mud and resistance. And even in victory, she had learned the same brutal lesson over and over again. In America, change isn't handed down from power. It's yanked from its grip. One finger at a time. Jasmine sat on the edge of the nearby bench, folded her arms and let her mind wander. Not into speeches or strategies, but into the places she rarely let anyone see. She thought of her cousin Jamal, thought of the night he didn't come home, the night they told her he matched a description, the night she saw his face on a mugshot, even though he had done nothing. She thought of the funeral, the way the priest's voice cracked on the phrase, "taken too soon," the way the air inside the church felt too thick to breathe. She thought of the mothers who had hugged her in hallways after hearings, the ones who didn't ask for selfies, just silence, just eye contact, just one moment where someone in power didn't look away from their pain. She thought of the folder she dropped in the middle of the hearing, and how for a split second, the room finally stopped performing and started listening. How truth, raw and undisguised, can pierce through any title, any party, any script. And she thought of Tim Scott, not as a rival, not even as a Republican, but as a man who had seen enough pain that he no longer knew where to put it. A man who had chosen the law to protect the house he built inside the system, while Jasmine had chosen it to burn down the parts that made her invisible. They weren't enemies, but they were never the same. And that was the other lesson. You can stand next to someone and still live in two different Americas. One where the badge means safety, and one where it means keep your hands where I can see them. One where the courtroom is justice, and one where it's a funeral delayed by paperwork. One where emotion is called passion, and one where it's called a threat. And no bill, not even this one, could bridge that chasm. Jasmine leaned back, let the cool stone meet her spine, and stared at the dome glowing above her like an indifferent moon. People were already calling her a hero, a reformer, a trailblazer. She hated those words. Not because they weren't true, but because they were armor. Armor people used to protect themselves from the real story, that she had to bleed for every inch of that bill, that she had to endure being called too angry, too radical, too unprofessional, just to be allowed to speak about dead children. That she had to be better than everyone in the room, twice as calm, 3 times as prepared, just to be seen as barely enough. That was the cost. And if there was one truth she wanted this country to finally confront, it was this. You don't get to ask people to smile while they're on fire. You don't get to demand grace from the people you've ignored. You don't get to call it unity when what you really want is silence. She rose slowly. Her bones ached, not with age but with memory. She stepped back into the hallway, passing the words etched above the entrance to the rotunda. E pluribus unum, out of many one. She paused, scoffed softly under her breath. Out of many, she whispered, some are still fighting to count. And that was the human lesson. That laws are easy to sign, but empathy can't be legislated. That justice isn't about majority votes. It's about majority conscience. That some wounds require more than policy. They require confession, accountability, and time. And until this country could do that, Jasmine knew this wasn't the end. It was the first breath before the next battle. And yet, even as Jasmine walked into the darkness outside the Capitol, something burned brighter than any headline. It wasn't relief. It wasn't triumph. It was resolve. The kind forged not in celebration, but in fire. Because she knew the cameras would move on. The news cycle would spin. The hashtags would cool. And most of the people clapping in that chamber would go back to their comfortable routines, satisfied that something had been done. But Jasmine wasn't satisfied. She couldn't be, because she had looked injustice in the eye, and it didn't flinch. It never does. So if you're watching this story unfold from your home, your phone, your silence, know this. The time for empathy alone is over. This isn't about feeling bad. It's about being brave. It's about choosing discomfort over distance, truth over tolerance, and action over applause. Jasmine didn't endure humiliation, compromise, and heartbreak so the public could nod, share a post, and move on. She stood in that chamber for the people who never got a hearing. She spoke for the boy who never made it to graduation. She bled, quietly, gracefully, for those who were taught that speaking too loudly was a crime. And now it's your turn, not to admire her, not to quote her, but to become a part of what she started. If you're tired of watching videos of unarmed black men dying in the streets, then stop being a spectator. If you're exhausted by the outrage cycle that begins at the funeral and ends with inaction, then change the ending. If you've ever said that's not who we are, then prove it, because the truth is, this is who we've been. And it'll stay that way until you do something more than watch. So here's where you begin. Not in Washington, not on Twitter, but in your community, your neighborhood, your city council, your police oversight board. Find out who makes the policies where you live, and don't stop until those policies reflect the dignity of every life. Write your representatives. Sit in the hearings no one live streams. Don't wait for the next tragedy to learn the name of your police chief. Call your school board. Ask what they're teaching your children about justice, about history, about humanity. Because change isn't made in applause. It's made in pressure. And yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it's messy. Yes, it means losing friends, making enemies, and standing alone sometimes. But Jasmine Crockett stood alone. She was mocked, undermined, sidelined, and still she showed up. Still she spoke. Still she wrote legislation with the same hands that once clenched at the news of her cousin's death. So what's your excuse? You don't need to be a lawmaker. You don't need to have a platform. You just need to decide that your silence isn't worth more than someone else's life. You just need to stop waiting for someone else to do it, because the law didn't change by itself. It didn't bend out of mercy. It bent because someone pushed. Jasmine pushed. And now it's your turn to carry it forward, because laws without hearts are useless, and hearts without courage are dangerous. So start with your heart. Unlearn what you've been told. Challenge the jokes you once laughed at. Interrupt the conversations where injustice hides behind politeness. Be louder than the systems that depend on your silence. Refuse to look away. Refuse to normalize the abnormal. Refuse to be numb. And if you're a teacher, teach truth, even when it shakes the room. If you're a parent, raise your children to see color, not ignore it. If you're a police officer, Listen harder, train better, and speak out even if your badge tells you not to. If you're white, understand that allyship is not applause, it's action. If you're black, understand that your rage is not only valid, it's necessary. This country was not changed by civility. It was changed by confrontation. So confront. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.